All right, hello everyone. Welcome to CSAJ's webinar today. Today we're talking about credit checks, an illegitimate barrier to employment for survivors. My name is Sarah Wee. I'm project manager for the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice, and we are so honored and privileged today to bring to you a really exciting webinar and training on credit checks and as a barrier to employment. And we're bringing Amy Traub, who's a senior policy analyst from DEMOS, a national policy advocacy organization. And we're just very, very excited, and we thank you all for joining us. And thanks for hanging on. We know that we have a small but mighty group, and there are a bunch more registered, so we're going to kind of let them trickle in as we go through some of the announcements and some of the technical things before we bring Amy to you. So just so you all know, this webinar is being recorded, and within a day or two afterwards, all materials, including the recording, will be posted on CSAJ's website. So we thank you for joining us live today and encourage you to check us out afterwards and share this, the webinar recording and other materials with your colleagues. Just a little orientation to how WebEx, this webinar platform, works. If you look at the lower right toolbar here, where, let me see if I can, right here, you should be able to see some different tabs, and if you hover over them, they'll produce different tools that you get to use. And this little word bubble one is the chat box. So we encourage you to select that and start chatting with all of the participants. You can also send private messages to myself, Erica, or Amy if you have specific questions. And then on the other side, you have, let me erase those. On the left side, you have, if you need to change the view of the webinar to put it into full screen, feel free to do that. And then finally, you should see a little hand signal in the middle of your platform here. If you have a specific question or have something really urgent you want to say, whether it's a technical problem or a content question, just let me know, and we'll get that question answered for you as soon as we can. So we'd love for you to give it a shot. If you can let us know who you are, what's your name and organization, and more importantly, what perspective are you bringing today to this webinar? You can use either the chat function or the Q&A, and we'll kind of introduce ourselves. Very own Erica is saying hello. We've got, Texas Council. Hi, Krista from the Texas Council on Family Violence. An attorney with Texas Rio Grande, so Texas is well represented. Hi. Katie. Minnesota. All right. Heading west. Yeah, and keep up the chat. We're having a really interesting and new topic that we're presenting, the idea of credit, how damaged credit manifests for survivors and the impact on employment. So we know a lot of folks are working in different fields within this sort of niche area, so we're really excited to hear both your experiences with this and what you're curious about. Teaching some financial classes, that's great. So we encourage you to use these tools throughout the webinar, and we'll have a few other spots where we'll ask for some of your participation. So thank you so much. So again, welcome. This is part 2 of a series CSAJ has had on credit. Last month we hosted where we brought Laura Russell to talk about credit reporting and repair for survivors. So needless to say, we will not be discussing that very much, although it is an important piece of this pie that we're talking about today. But we will be talking about the issue of employment credit checks more broadly, and really couching it in the survivor experience. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to CSAJ's Executive Director, Erica Sussman, to help kick us off today. Erica, are you with us?
I am. Thank you so much, Sarah. And thanks, everybody, for joining us today. I'm thrilled to be involved in today's webinar training. I feel particularly lucky that we have Amy Traub joining us today, and I have looked at the participant list, and really what I see is diverse expertise from folks all over the country touching upon this issue of credit checks for survivors. So I'm really excited, as Sarah had mentioned, to see what all of us have to contribute to this new conversation. I want to talk a little bit about the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice. The Center for Survivor Agency and Justice develops transformative advocacy approaches that match institutional structures, organizational programs, and professional practices with domestic violence survivors' lived realities. And the focus of our work over the course of the past 10 or so years has been particularly on the intersection between domestic violence and poverty. So I want to talk with you a little bit about our one of our programs that does just that. And that is the Consumer Rights for Domestic Violence Survivors Initiative. This initiative is a national project that enhances economic justice for survivors by building the capacity of lawyers and advocates to provide consumer and other economic civil legal advocacy and engage in systemic advocacy that removes barriers to economic security for survivors. We've been around, this particular project has been around since 2007. We started with some funding through the Office for Victims of Crime. And we're currently funded through the Office on Violence Against Women to provide technical assistance across the country to folks who are advocating for the rights of domestic violence and sexual assault survivors. We have lots of partners that make this work possible, and some of them are listed here: the National Consumer Law Center, Home Free, which is based out of Oregon, the Center for Court Innovation in New York City, Wider Opportunities for Women in Washington, D.C., and we also work with a wonderful group of expert advisors who hold really unique expertise at the intersection of different consumer and domestic violence related issues. So all of our work is enriched through their participation. I want to just generally share with you some of what our work looks like, but I encourage you to reach out to us after today's call and explore our website if you have the time. First is that we're currently working on a guidebook and a series of advocacy briefs that are intended to provide direct service providers with really concrete information around economic and consumer rights for survivors. This guidebook that we're working is going to cover an array of topics that are particularly coming from the perspective of domestic violence survivors advocacy. And so we are deep into the development of this guidebook, and we will definitely keep folks posted on its progress. We also create lots of webinars like the one that you're listening today on a whole bunch of different topics. If you're interested in checking out some past webinars, you can hop on our website and get some recordings and all of the materials. And then last but definitely not least, we work with a group of demonstration sites across the country that do really groundbreaking work. They're listed here, and some of them are participating on the webinar today, so I'm thrilled to have you with us. Our demonstration sites include the Texas Council on Family Violence, the Women's Resource Center in Scranton, Pennsylvania, Indiana Legal Services Low-Income Taxpayer Clinic, and also the University of Denver School of Law Civil Litigation Clinic. All of these groups are involved in really interesting, on-the-ground economic justice work that takes a careful look at some of the institutional barriers that survivors face in accessing economic security, and all of whom are forging some really innovative solutions. Lots of information about that if you're interested. So turning to the topic of today's program, today we're going to focus on an issue that is new to many of us, but that is certainly a persistent barrier that survivors and their advocates face across the country, and that is the issue of credit checks by employers. So employers commonly use credit checks during the application and hiring process as a way of, quote unquote, weeding out so-called risky employees. But there is a lot of data that shows that credit checks don't actually benefit or protect employers, and that and we do know that the practice has huge negative implications in terms of employment opportunities for job seekers, and that is certainly so for domestic violence survivors. Survivors of domestic violence often experience coerced debt and damaged credit, and employment credit checks may create a huge problem for survivors who have bad credit as a result of their abusive partner, thereby serving as a second form of victimization. So today we're going to be delving into discussion of this topic, both in terms, primarily in terms of policy, but also in terms of thinking about how individual advocacy might interact with those broader policy avenues. We're going to talk first generally about what the landscape looks like in terms of credit checks across the country and thinking about the disparate impact that it has. We'll then turn more specifically to looking at the survivor experience and context and what we know about the effectiveness of individual advocacy strategies. And then we're going to look more closely at the New York City ban on employer credit checks, as well as a look at some other efforts across the country, and think more broadly about systems advocacy strategies that might be applicable to your own communities. So here are the objectives for today. Understand the connection between credit and employment access in the context of domestic violence survivors' lives. Describe the practice of and current policies related to employment credit checks. Discuss individual advocacy strategies, and develop community and systems change strategies to remove credit-related barriers. So with all of that said, I want to introduce Amy Traub, who is joining us as faculty for today. Amy is a senior policy analyst at DEMOS, which is a public policy organization working for an America where we all have an equal say in our democracy and an equal chance in our economy. Amy has a broad research focus on consumer debt, job quality and job creation, and policies to build the American middle class. She is a leader in the effort to restrict the use of consumer credit history in employment, and her study discredited how employment credit checks keep qualified workers out of a job was the first that quantified the impact of credit checks on job seekers. She's presented expert testimony on employment credit checks to legislators in various states and has helped to advise legislative efforts in Congress as well. Prior to joining DEMOS in 2011, Amy worked at the Drum Major Institute for Public Policy. She holds a master's in political science from Columbia, where she completed coursework toward a PhD. So I am thrilled to introduce you to Amy, and also want to mention that Sarah Wee, who you've already met, will also be serving as faculty during today's program. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the program over to Amy.
Thank you, Erica, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to be here with you. I'm going to start out by giving you a little background about how Demos got involved with this issue. About 10 years ago, Demos started researching credit card debt, and we were challenging the narrative that was dominant at that time, that people mostly ran up credit card debt because they were irresponsible or just didn't know how to handle money. What we found through our research is that, on the contrary, many low and middle income households were using their credit cards to make ends meet at a time when the cost of living was rising faster than most household incomes and when the social safety net was increasingly frayed. We called this the plastic safety net. Households relying on their plastic, that is their credit cards, to make up for holes in the public safety net as well as stagnating wages. Our work on credit reporting comes out of that. If you take on credit card debt that you struggle to pay back, even if it is to pay medical bills or to keep up with basic necessities after a job loss, nevertheless, it can ruin your credit. And then we found having poor credit can have a host of other consequences, including making it more difficult to get a job. That brings us to employment credit checks and why they're an illegitimate and discriminatory barrier to employment. My work focuses on credit checks in general, and as Erica mentioned, CSAJ is going to then situate the problem in the context of survivors. So we can take a step back and ask, what is an employment credit check? I think that a lot of people don't even realize that employers can look at a job applicant's personal credit history. What employers cannot legally request is a credit score for employment purposes. But under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, an employer may say that as a condition of being hired or even considered for a job applicant must give them the right to obtain their credit report. So if a job applicant refuses to authorize a credit check, the employer can refuse to consider them for the job. The credit report includes information on all types of debts and accounts: mortgage debt, data on student loans, amounts of car payments, details on credit card accounts, including all the balances, credit limits, monthly payments, bankruptcy records, bills, including medical debts that are in collection, and tax liens. And if it's not immediately obvious how this personal financial information is relevant to employment, that's because it's not. Credit reports were developed to help lenders make decisions about loans by providing a picture of someone's financial obligations and payment history. But then, and I'm trying to click through to my next slide here, but oh, here we go. Yes, it worked. Then credit reports were marketed to employers because the three big credit reporting companies, you see them here, TransUnion, Equifax, and Experian, saw a new opportunity for profit in selling this existing product that they had already developed for lenders to a new market. In many countries, credit reporting is a public function, but in the U.S., Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion are always looking for new markets to sell the information that they collect on 200 million Americans, and they market their product very aggressively. So I want to note that credit reports may be purchased by employers not just through these companies, through any number of companies that offer employment background checks. And they could be bundled with things like checks of criminal records or other public data. So companies like AccuScreen, HireRight, GoodHire.com sell these employment background checks, but the credit portion of the report is typically supplied by one of these three big global corporations that you see here. Now, we know that in 2012, nearly half of employers nationwide reported that they conduct credit checks when hiring for some or all positions, such the red and blue portions of the pie chart here. That's 13% who checked credit for everyone who they ever hired, from the janitor to the CEO, and another 34% who checked credit for some but not all new hires. And the other half of employers made their hires without looking at someone's personal credit information. So what types of positions are these that credit is being checked for? Some are senior management jobs, CEO, COO, but that really just scrapes the surface. You can look online at job posting sites like Monster.com or Craigslist, and you'll find help wanted ads that say a credit check is required for positions as diverse as doing maintenance work, offering telephone tech support, assisting in an office, working as a delivery driver, selling insurance, working as a home care aide, or, and this one is my favorite here because the ad is so bright and colorful, selling frozen yogurt. This is an ad from I Poppet Yogurt in Colorado Springs. I don't know if you can see it here. They are looking for part-time yogurtistas who will be paid $8.50 an hour. A high school diploma is not required, but you must be willing to submit to a credit check. And I use this really to illustrate that credit checks are not restricted only to top financial positions. We found that credit checks are particularly prevalent in the retail industry, at all levels of the industry, from cashiers and stock clerks and salespeople to managers. So we've seen that employment credit checks are common. In 2012, Demos conducted a survey to assess the impact of employment credit checks. And we piggybacked on the larger research project I mentioned earlier. For a number of years, Demos has looked at a nationally representative sample of low and middle income households carrying credit card debt. And in 2012, we added questions about employment credit checks to our survey for the first time. We found that among survey participants who were unemployed, 1 in 4 of them recalled that a prospective employer had requested a credit check as part of a job application. The challenge is that job applicants are really asked to send a lot of forms when they apply for a job. So many people may not even remember that they authorized a credit check, and therefore we actually think that this 1 in 4 figure is probably too low. Now, there's very little public data about the rate at which people are denied jobs due to credit checks, so we were very eager to include that question in our own survey. And we found that 1 in 10 participants in our survey who are unemployed have been told that they wouldn't be hired for a job because of the information in their credit report. At the same time, 1 in 7 survey participants with credit scores under 620, and that's often the cutoff for poor credit, which would be visible in the credit report. The poor credit would be visible in a credit report an employer would see, even if they wouldn't see the score. So 1 in 7 survey participants with poor credit have been told they would not be hired for a job because of information in their credit report. Now here too, we think these numbers are too low, and they pretty dramatically underreport the incidence of losing job opportunities due to your credit, because a lot of people never find out that their credit was the reason they lost a job. By law, employers are supposed to send an adverse action notice if their decision not to hire someone is based, even in part, on their credit. But this is very difficult to enforce. Our sense is that employers almost never send these notices, and many people never know they lost a job because of their credit. So we hear from people who are denied job after job and may never find out it was because of their credit, or they find out only in passing, and then they wonder, did that have to do with other jobs before this one that I thought I was going to get and then didn't? I want to note that some employers also run credit checks on their current employees, for example, when they're making decisions about promotions or about firing. And people do get fired from their jobs for having poor credit, although unfortunately we don't have good data on how common that is. We don't think it's very common. Now this is the point in my presentation where people often start to wonder why employers are doing these credit checks in the first place. As I mentioned, credit reports are aggressively marketed to employers, and I want to share a little bit of what that looks like. Here's the pitch to employers. We see vague but disturbing claims like this: protect your finances, run a credit check for jobs to be sure you're trusting the right person. You gain valuable insight not only into that person's financial stability, but also their sense of responsibility. Since stability and responsibility are two qualities high on any employer's hiring list, an employee credit check offers the perfect way to get that indicator of possible future behavior. This is from accuscreen.com. And I think this is a great marketing pitch because every employer wants to hire a hardworking, responsible employee who's going to be honest and not steal from the company. The problem is there's just not evidence that employment credit checks actually reveal this information. And the credit reporting companies, when they're pushed and when they're under oath, they will even admit this. So we saw the marketing pitch. Here is the reality. In 2010, a spokesman for TransUnion told the Oregon State Legislature, "We don't have any research to show any statistical correlation between what's in somebody's credit report and their job performance or their likelihood to commit fraud." The truth is there have been only a handful of peer-reviewed academic studies that analyze the validity of employment credit checks in an employment context, just a handful of studies at all. And among the few studies out there, most really don't replicate the real context of an employer looking at a credit report as part of the hiring process. None of the studies conclusively show that credit checks tell an employer anything about who will be honest, hardworking, or responsible as an employee. Now, what employers look for in a credit report and how much they weigh the different factors like late bills, foreclosures, or accounts that may be in collection, it's completely arbitrary. For one employer on one day, a single late bill could be interpreted as a sign that a job applicant lacks responsibility and can't be trusted at a cash register. Another employer could look at multiple bills in collection and be reminded of their own difficulty coping with uninsured hospital expenses when their child needed an emergency operation. A credit reporting mistake that's too small to make a difference in applying for credit might nevertheless stand out to an employer and cost someone a job. And that goes for mistakes, obviously, but also actual facts about somebody's credit. The reality is that since nothing on a consumer's credit report has been proven to predict an employee's job performance or propensity to steal, any interpretation an employer makes winds up being subjective. We've also made the case as part of our campaigns to ban employment credit checks that checking credit ultimately harms employers as well as job applicants and employees. Credit checks are relatively inexpensive, and employers tend to use them late in the screening process. So it's not that it's a big cost issue for employers, but there is a danger that employers are filtering out people based on this irrelevant factor and really could be weeding out applicants who might turn out later to be their best employees. Checking credit takes some of the focus off employee skills and other factors that really are the most relevant in hiring and puts some of it into this irrelevant factor. So we've discussed how credit checks operate as a barrier to employment and they are unnecessary, but now I'm going to share some evidence about how pernicious they really are. This is the disparate impact of employment credit checks. The first point is that employment credit checks can have a discriminatory impact. The credit histories of Latino and African American consumers have suffered as a result of discrimination in lending, housing, and in employment itself. And this slide shows you some data from DMOS's survey of low and middle income households with credit card debt. But it really mirrors numerous other studies by the Federal Reserve, the Federal Trade Commission, and others that have consistently found that average credit scores of African American and Latino consumers are lower than those of white consumers on average. We see here that among low and middle income households carrying credit card debt, 65% of white households say they have good or excellent credit, compared to 55% of Latino households and just 43% of African American households. And African American households are twice as likely to describe their credit as poor than they are to say that it's excellent, which is the reverse of white households. And it's really important to discuss where these credit disparities come from. We have a tremendous racial wealth gap in this country. In 2011, the median white household had $111,146, I'm going to say that number again so I don't screw it up, $111,146 in wealth holdings compared to just $7,113 for the median Black household and $8,348 for the median Latino household. And the racial wealth gap itself is the result of discriminatory policy decisions that go back decades and really centuries, from the continuing impact of redlining on American homeownership to predatory lending that continues to target communities of color today. Demos President Heather McGee says that the racial wealth gap is where history shows up in your wallet. And I would add, this is also where history shows up in your credit score. So we can't delve too deeply into the roots of the racial wealth gap now, but we need to keep it in mind as we consider the consequences, and one of them is this. Households of color are disproportionately forced to borrow to deal with emergencies at times when white households are more likely to have savings and wealth to fall back on. At the same time, we know that neighborhoods of color have been targeted for high-cost predatory loans, and all of this means that debt burdens are harder to pay back, resulting in disproportionately poor credit, and that is what we're seeing in this chart. Employment credit checks amplify this legacy of injustice, and they bring it back into the realm of employment. What credit checks effectively do is look at someone whose community may have been targeted and may have had their home endangered by predatory lending, and turn around and then treat that as evidence that this person cannot be a responsible employee. And thinking about that happening, and we've seen it happen, makes me really angry at a personal level. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has repeatedly warned employers about the discriminatory impact of their use of credit reports as a hiring tool, and numerous civil rights organizations, including the NAACP, the National Council of La Raza, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and the National Urban League, have publicly opposed the use of employment credit checks. Now, I have made the case that people of color are disproportionately impacted by employment credit checks, but a much broader range of job seekers can be harmed. And I don't want to say that this is only an issue in communities of color, because it is much broader. I want to go back to Demos's research on credit card debt among middle and low-income households. We found that most families carrying credit card debt go into debt to pay for basic expenses: groceries, utilities, child care, and health care. Their wages just don't keep up with the cost of living. In our survey of low and moderate income households, 40% of credit card indebted families had used their credit cards to pay for basic expenses, and 52% had used them to pay for medical care in the past year. And this is just credit card debt. We didn't look at other kinds of debt. Other kinds of debt also show up on credit reports and are also very relevant. But our focus was on credit cards. Simply put, Americans are borrowing to make ends meet, and CSAJ will have more to say about how this impacts survivors particularly. Thinking about medical debt, half of all bills in collection, these are the bills that appear on a credit report, are for medical debt. And so you see people in situations where there's a child with a medical condition that requires expensive surgery, and that may only be partially covered by insurance, or maybe they don't have insurance. That looks bad on the credit report, those bills, and it can end up keeping somebody out of a job. And again, not having health insurance is a major contributor to medical debt that can, again, look bad on a credit report and become a reason to deny someone a job when there's an employment credit check involved. Another contributor to bad credit is unemployment itself. You have difficulty keeping up with bills when you lose a source of income. This is a real catch-22 for people. Someone's out of work, and without income, they fall behind on their bills. Then, because they're behind on their bills, their credit is flawed, and they can't get a new job. You have to wonder, quite honestly, what we're expecting people to do in this situation. Identity theft is another consideration. Job applicants can be blocked from employment if someone else took out loans and ran up bills in their name. And many people don't even know this has happened, and they aren't aware that's the reason that they're not getting jobs. Again, there are even more reasons for survivors to be concerned about identity theft, and I'm really glad that CSAJ will be addressing those. But it's a concern for the population as a whole beyond survivors as well. Errors in credit reports are rampant, and the process to get them resolved is deeply flawed. A recent study by the Federal Trade Commission found that 1 in 5 consumers had an error on at least one of their 3 credit reports. It's an estimated 42 million consumers. And I mentioned before that the process by which employers evaluate credit reports is very subjective. That means it's impossible to know how much any given error would end up impacting someone's chances of employment. Finally, I'd like to raise the issue of privacy, and this is certainly a concern for survivors. family breakup, in the general population, family breakup and medical problems are among the leading reasons that Americans become unable to pay their debts. And these very personal concerns for anyone are often revealed in an employment credit check. And job seekers just shouldn't have to expose the details of these very personal matters just in order to get a job. In many cases, particularly with medical information, confidentiality is supposed to be protected by federal laws. Federal law, the confidentiality of medical information, but indicators can show up on a credit report, and then an employer can say, gee, you have all these bills in collection, would you explain that? And somebody's put in a position where explaining it means revealing a medical condition that they should by law be able to keep private. My understanding now is that if folks have any questions or thoughts about what I've said, that this is a time that we can discuss, so I'd be glad to do that. You can speak or type a question in the Q&A bar of the webinar.
Yeah, this is Erica. So thank you so much, Amy, for all of that really rich information. And as Amy mentioned, if folks have any questions or even want to share any experiences or observations related to this topic or Amy's comments thus far, you can do that by just typing into the chat or the Q&A on the right-hand side. Anything at all. We'd love to hear about what you're seeing out there around this, what you've seen either with survivors or more broadly related to what's happening within your community or state. Okay, not a lot of traffic, which is totally fine. Know that we will give you some more opportunities to chime in along the way. So feel free to send your comments our way at any point, really, and we will make sure that we get to them at our next pause. So why don't we then move on to the next section of the presentation, which will be focusing more specifically on the context of all of this, how this plays out specifically for survivors of domestic violence. And Sarah Wee will be starting our conversation on that front.
Yeah, thank you, Erica, and wow, thank you again, Amy. That was wonderful and really, really, as Eric said, rich information. And do everyone on the call start thinking about how you're seeing this happen, because we will have other opportunities to engage. So, and if you're having trouble asking a question, just before we move on, the best, you can do it through the Q&A, and then we can kind of relay it that way, and typing it in, and also through the chat box. At the end of our call today, if there's some time, we can try to unmute some folks so we can hear you. But for now, if you can type them in, that would be great, and we can get to them as we move on. So just to couch this, what Amy just spoke about in the survivor experience, I want to sort of paint a big picture of what's going on, especially since I know that we do have a diverse audience, meaning some folks that are less familiar in working with survivors particularly. So I do want to kind of go from big picture to bring it back down and draw out specifically a little bit more about how credit can create barriers to employment for survivors. So to do that, we have documented some of the research around this issue as well. And that research has really well documented that a really strong link between poverty and domestic violence. And as you can see here, women living in poverty experience domestic violence at twice the rate of those who do not, and up to 70% and beyond. And some other studies of women receiving public welfare have reported abuse. So we know that there's this connection, and this is what we're really keen on parsing out. And research has also documented a really strong link between the fact that all forms of abuse can lead to economic instability. In particular, Adrienne Adams in 2008 did some really interesting and the first research of its kind really to unpack this issue and ask the question, what is the impact of economic abuse? And they found that 99% of their study participants experienced some type of economic abuse throughout the course, at some point in the course of their relationship. And they really focus on these three key areas in the middle of this quote and how economic resources are manipulated and prevent survivors' ability to acquire, use, and maintain such resources. And this has really devastating impacts, and the impacts are many. We see that access to income as well as other material and economic resources such as transportation and child care are really key to obtaining long-term safety. And without that, and taken all together, it really decreases the option, restricts safety options that survivors have at their disposal throughout the process of whether they're in a relationship, leaving, and also long after, as well as increasing, therefore, risk of future violence. And the key piece that CSAJ has really been focused on is drawing this out and expanding it beyond the immediate effects, which is where a lot of the research lies today, and understanding that there's really this economic ripple effect of domestic violence. And you can see this here in this graphic that we've created. And today, we really are trying to explore one such droplet, if you will, and how that creates a ripple effect, and that is damaged credit and the impact, therefore, of credit checks across the life course for survivors. So in doing so, these are some of the questions we're really looking at. What's the impact of economic abuse on survivors' credit and employment, and how are we all seeing damaged credit ripple throughout survivors' lives? So I do want to turn this over to everyone. What are you seeing related to these questions? How do you see survivors' employment opportunities impacted by credit?
So we're asking folks to type in your experiences in the chat box or in the Q&A box along the right-hand side.
Exactly. We did ask this question a little bit as you all registered to jog your memory. Is this happening in your community? Have you worked specifically with survivors on this issue? And also let us know if it's new to you. While you all are thinking on that, I will move on. This is what we surveyed you all as you were registering for today, and I thought it important to really share with you some of what's going on. There's a big sense of both shame and fear in the relationship between damaged credit and the stigma of having poor credit, and just as Amy kind of unpacked how other people perceive people with low credit scores or damaged credit and things like that. And the impact it has for survivors is really unique. Then folks are also seeing survivors getting passed over on certain jobs or being relegated to a particular industry or a type of job or a type of pay scale. The inability to even obtain credit is also important, which I feel like these last couple bullet points really demonstrates how their economic stability is threatened. There's increased risk of manipulation, and it's tied to other things such as housing and important resources. I'm seeing a couple things come in the Q&A now.
Yeah, so someone is talking about how they haven't seen an effect on employment per se, but But it could also be that it has been a hidden reason, right? Amy was talking about that earlier, that sometimes folks aren't really even aware of it until later down the road.
Yeah, and I'm hearing here also from Amara that several clients are not even bothering to apply to certain employers because they know they won't be hired, and they know first that they'll do a credit check or they're required to do one, and so therefore, why even bother? Yeah.
Other people are talking about how it impairs their ability to open bank accounts or get credit cards. Yeah, I think that covers all of the comments so far.
Yeah, and also the ability to maintain employment and deal with debts and the implications on other things such as housing and dealing with other loans and accessing other resources is really key, which is why we're trying to touch on this issue a little bit today. So thank you all for that, both in the registration and right now.
Carla also hopped in to talk about kind of how all of the stress related to these barriers to economics have health consequences for survivors as well.
Yeah. And what we're going to go into a little bit now is kind of looking on either side of the coin, the credit side and the employment side, and we know they both present a lot of stress by themselves, and so when we start to look at the space in between, it's really important to really consider the effects of stress in dealing with all of these barriers, especially when the onus is on the survivors to deal with all of these things. So what you see here is the slide that Amy presented a little earlier, and when we were discussing her work a little earlier, the language of how credit checks penalize the hardship that many are experiencing in our country really touched on some key and some specific ways in which they also act to re-victimize survivors. So we kind of want to bring the language down even further. And this kind of happens in the ways that economic abuse manifests as damaged credit. Some of the unique impacts that the credit reporting system has for survivors, which we discussed in part 1 of our series on dealing with errors and repair in the dispute process. And then most importantly, the safety and privacy risks that they impose. And Amy touched on it, and we'll kind of talk about it as it relates specifically to survivors. So I kind of want to flesh out these 3 points a little bit. And to get right to the point, there's this really unique catch-22 that talks about how this plays out for survivors, and that is that abuse often produces bad credit and restricts employment as well as other income opportunities, and then credit checks prevent survivors from obtaining employment, leaving them vulnerable to further violence and economic insecurity. So this really says it all, but in terms of how abuse kind of produces this and looking at credit and employment, there are a couple ways that this shows up. So earlier I talked about Adrienne Adams and that 99% of survivors say they experience some type of economic abuse. But we also know that she went a little bit deeper, and 81% report having trouble with their credit rating, and over 50% reported the fact that their credit rating made it difficult to get a phone. So we know that damaged credit really impacts their access to many resources. So no doubt it's sort of at play in a lot of opportunities and restricting those opportunities. We also know, and this really comes from work by Angela Litwin on coerced debt and identity theft, that in many types of relationships, coerced debt and identity theft are pretty easy to do or pretty easy for an abusive partner to accomplish. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this since we talked about it last month, but we've put some examples here. For example, how immigrant survivors, abusers might obtain an illegal social security number, but then use that not only to control survivors, but to open up credit cards and put a lot of debt in their name. For LGBT survivors, there's some evidence of identity theft and stealing passports and easy access to personal information. And in addition to this, the credit discrimination piece here is a link. The Center for American Progress recently released a really interesting video, actually, on how the LGBT community is still facing a lot of credit discrimination, and that goes with other marginalized populations, and that it's really hard to build any good credit because of that discrimination. So I encourage you to take a look at that and think about it in the context of this flip side that we're talking about a little bit too. And then on the other side of this coin, we're looking at how survivors experience under and unemployment. And there's a bunch of research that talks about how this is a persistent issue. For example, in one study, 71% of survivors report employment being a problem well after seeking help, well after removing themselves or ending a relationship. And we also know that unemployment is related and associated with abuse over time. And so this is an important thing in terms of what's making this a problem, particularly for survivors. And this impact of job insecurity really has long-lasting effects. And there's some more recent research and focus on this area, and this is one example where even in a relationship or if abuse has ended up to 3 years ago, folks are still losing up to 3 months of paid work on an annual basis. So this, no doubt, this has some pretty obvious impacts on not only job benefits or benefits received through working, but also on other actual hardships in the future and anticipated hardships. So there's a real sense that I'm going to be dealing with this for a very long time and just struggling through it, which, as Amy mentioned later, is really an unfair and illegitimate restriction to opportunity. And so last month, we really presented the credit reporting system and how to repair credit reports as a unique link between coerced debt, damaged credit, those experiences, and unemployment. So again, I encourage you to go there, but it's a good example. Amy said earlier that about half of all debt held, it tends to be medical debt. Well, survivors can have up to 4 times the medical costs of their counterparts who report never being abused. And it adds up on an annual basis. Medical debt among survivors can equal up to $4.1 billion in terms of the national economy. So there are some new regulations that are highlighting how credit reporting agencies are looking at medical debt, and there are some changes that are coming down the pike that are important to be aware of. But there are also the errors, the dispute process, and the clunky and cumbersome system that Laura Russell really talked about, and how that can impact survivors in the long term, and it just becomes really slippery footing and has a lot of impact. And
so let me just pipe in there, Sarah. So the document that appears up on that screen is something that is going to be released by CSAJ imminently, and it's a summary of the recent settlement agreement with the various credit reporting agencies, and it does include, in addition to the medical debt related provision, it includes some other provisions that are also potentially favorable to survivors in the credit realm. So keep your eyes open for that information.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Erica. The end note and the last of these 3 issues that we're trying to highlight really is this privacy issue and what Amy mentioned as making the choice between having to disclose some information that otherwise would be protected in an employment situation. And for survivors, that can really act as as a form of re-victimization. And that includes disclosing abuse, marital or relationship status, divorce, disclosing a divorce or medical debt or other forms of debt, and how they've sort of surfaced for survivors, in addition to what other risks and safety risks talking about all these things might pose. And so a couple of years ago, this language here at the bottom of the slide, I think says really well the choice and the consequences of that choice that survivors are faced with in this process. And a few years ago, CSHA, in partnership with DEMOS as well as a few others, did some advocacy for the Equal Employment for All Act, which Amy's going to talk about a little bit later, I think. And we really tried to underscore this issue about how imposing these choices, what their effects are on survivors. And Eric, I don't know if there are other things to say about that process or what we kind of learned from that a couple years ago.
No, I mean, I think that this language sort of encapsulates some of what we tried, the perspective that we hope to bring to bear, and I'm looking forward to, continuing this, hopefully with some input from folks on this call today, as we try and highlight the particular risks related to survivors of domestic violence.
Right. So from there, what we thought would be good is to really look at what some advocacy approaches are given this issue that we've just described and what Amy provided earlier. So we have kind of two camps, and in all likelihood they probably occur at the same time. We talk about credit repair, which again I'll refer you to the last our part one with Laura Russell on credit reporting and repair, which really has to do with understanding what a credit report is, how to pull them, how to review them, identifying errors, figuring out how to disentangle finances, going through any sort of dispute process, as well as prioritizing how to pay off debts and start to build and repair credit back up. But obviously, from the picture, that takes a lot of time and a lot of effort in some cases that many people probably don't have the luxury of doing prior to seeking employment, changing employment, trying to advance employment. So here, we're going to talk a little bit about some advocacy strategies when talking about when a survivor is applying for the job. And again, there are kind of 2 points of advocacy that we want to lay out for you, the hiring process, and then if a survivor is denied based on credit. So to tackle the first I'm going to present that there are a couple caveats. Number one, with these questions that we've laid out, laws on credit checks vary by state. So it's important to get familiar with what your state or even local laws are about employment credit checks. Which Amy will, again, discuss a little bit later, because if any of these kind of pop up for a survivor and there are limits or bans to credit checks, that'll be an important indicator in terms of options. And then 2, we're really presenting these questions as a framework of some things to consider in partnership with a survivor while you're working with survivors, and applying survivor-centered advocacy approach to credit checks is really key, because a look at doing some safety, risk, and benefit analysis is really key to this process. So in general, to kind of walk through some of these questions, the first 2, as I mentioned, depend on the laws of your state a little bit. In general, a credit check should be presented in writing as a standalone document. And as I mentioned, if your state does limit or ban credit checks, but you find out that they're still happening, it's a good indicator that something's going on between the law and practice, and there might be not only options in terms of legal remedies for individual survivors, but also a possible opportunity for some employment to educate employers or whatnot on being aware of and complying with the law. Whether or not a survivor can opt out. As Amy mentioned before, you can refuse this in any part of the background check, but then employers can also refuse to hire you. So refusal could raise some suspicions at best and do some other things. So this, again, underscores the need to kind of talk this out in partnership with a survivor about options, what feels best, what makes most sense for a particular survivor. And moving on to the next two questions, what to say if an employer asks about a credit check. Again, kind of thinking about it beforehand, one option is to agree and kind of address it if then you're asked to explain it, and making the decision what to do. And if an employer asks to explain the credit check, here is where a lot of the risks and benefits come into play. Some sub-questions here could be definitely considering the risks and benefits of sharing relationship information, how certain credit information, as well as even considering whether or not the partner is still a safety risk for the survivor and what pulling a report and going through some of this other employment hiring practices will mean for survivors. And then there's how do you prepare? Can you bring a document? Can you pull a report? Are you already disputing errors? Is there a way that you can present some of that documentation to an employer to explain what's going on, whether it's an error or an actual issue that you're working on, letters from people. And then as Amy mentioned, which I think is really important in a hiring process, reframing this conversation to emphasize the fit with the job, the skills, the strengths, the qualifications that the survivor has to perform the job at hand, rather than relying on some of this, rather than relying on credit checks as an indicator of personal responsibility and reliability. So that's in general, and I don't know if any folks on the call have done some of this work and want to share some other success stories or interesting experiences they've had as you've really been working to through the job application and hiring process. But definitely think about this piece as we go into this final piece on being denied a job based on credit. And I'm going to ask Erica to kind of chime in with some tidbits. As she mentioned, we've been working with some folks to help illuminate some of these issues. So I know this slide breaks a lot of rules of PowerPoint development, but we wanted to lay out the legal language here for you based on the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which in summary, I'll just kind of walk through that applicants are entitled to an adverse action notice, which kind of comes in two parts. Prior to taking adverse action, an employer must provide the applicant with notice. That includes a copy of the consumer report that they pulled to make the decision, as well as a copy of the summary of your rights under FCRA, and which we've linked it to the actual summary so you can get a little bit more detail as well. And in talking with some folks about how this plays out, they tell us that this presents a quote-unquote theoretical opportunity, just as we talked about before in terms of explaining your credit report. This process should, in theory, present an opportunity to identify any inaccuracies, explain credit, talk about any dispute process, but of course that means that the survivor would be well aware of some of their credit issues, which we've talked about. Some of you have mentioned that survivors aren't applying for certain jobs where they know that's going to have to be a conversation they have, and that's really a call for some of the systems advocacy I think that we're leaning towards. And then the second piece of this is in taking adverse action, employers have to provide even more information, which includes the name, address, and phone number of the CRA that supplied the report, a statement that says the agency did not make the decision, it was the employer, as well as a notice of the right to dispute the accuracy and completeness of the report. So if this doesn't happen in a hiring process, then there's some claim for, there may be a case for a dispute under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. I know Erica had some other nuggets on that piece.
You know, I'm actually gonna, I'm not gonna hop in here because I'm looking at the time right now, and so I think that provides a pretty good overview. Yeah, I think it does.
Great. And so then the final question is sort of whether or not job denial based on credit either is an example of employment discrimination or if that also comes up. So we just wanted to provide some of the basics here, that in general Title VII of the Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination based on various protected classes, and this each state may have expanded protected classes as well. So if a survivor or an advocate working with a survivor thinks you may have a case here, we provided some links to get an overview of what anti-discrimination laws are as they relate to survivors, as well as just points to really engage with an employment attorney to talk about what that means, and then all employment discrimination claims are filed with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So there are some links there to go deeper into that piece.
I will quickly jump in here because I think it's just worth mentioning that. So earlier, Amy had mentioned the disparate impact that credit checks have on communities of color. And so, you know, under Title VII, folks can make a claim that there is a that credit checks, in fact, have a disparate impact. And an employer can, in theory, and we can talk more about practicality, but in theory, an employer can be liable for a disparate impact, for discrimination that has a disparate impact on a particular group, where there's a policy or a practice that has the effect of disproportionately screening out that protected group, and the employer fails to demonstrate that that policy is job-related for the position. So, so that's, you know, that is kind of the framework of the disparate impact jurisprudence. Again, you know, Sarah had mentioned consulting with an employment discrimination attorney, and that would be critical. There have been some cases where folks have been successful in pursuing disparate impact claims involving companies where they've relied on criminal histories and various types of background checks, most of them broader than just credit checks. But it is challenging, and again, it's best to check in with somebody who has expertise in this area.
So given that, and all of this information that we've inundated you with, we want to turn it back to you again and talk about, in terms of advocacy approaches, what your experiences are and whether there have been strategies that you've done that have been successful. So any thoughts on this work, whether advocacy or legal advocacy approaches to addressing this issue?
Yeah, I'm really curious about this because I know that people are aware of this barrier existing for folks, and I'm just wondering whether people have, in fact, been doing direct work with clients either before a job interview or after a decision has been made to try and advocate with clients, and what some of those creative strategies may have been. So if folks want to share those with us now, that would be great. And we'll, of course, love to hear from you either now or even after the call as we strategize about this issue ourselves. I see something coming up here.
Right, this has to, Carla is giving some info about how long information, negative information can stay on a credit report. And generally it expires after 7.5 years, except if you're above, if you make above $75,000. So, which just demonstrates that a lot of people and survivors in particular who are dealing with perhaps protracted issues are really talking about very old debt, which is, as Amy mentioned before, personally frustrating as well as systematically a barrier that many are facing.
I also think that this underscores, you know, we've talked about the remedies, and I think that it underscores the need for partnership around this issue, not only in terms of partnership with folks doing policy advocacy and partnerships between policy and direct service folks, but also people who have a different focus area. So, for example, non-lawyer advocates may be able to flex their muscles on the, you know, credit reporting and repair front and prep for interview front, while attorneys who are consumer lawyers and have expertise in the Fair Credit Reporting Act may be needed in order to enforce people's rights under that act, while attorneys with employment discrimination and Title VII expertise may need to be tapped into if there seems to be practice that is discriminatory against communities of color or other protected classes under Title VII. So lots of different people can play a role in this type of advocacy.
Yeah, which is a great segue as folks, please do continue to send in some experiences, but as a good segue to bring this kind of back to Amy to talk about some of the systems change work that she and her colleagues at DEMOS have done, because I think it really underscores a need to do some of this systems to remove these barriers while we're doing some of this individual effort. So Amy.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Dozens of cities and states have introduced legislation that would restrict employment credit checks, and 11 so far have actually passed laws. And as you mentioned, as Sarah mentioned, there's also legislation pending in Congress, the Equal Employment for All Act, which is a very strong, would be a very strong law, is now a very strong bill. But of course, it's very hard to get anything passed in Washington, D.C. And so we see probably the most energy and momentum around laws at the city and state level. And I'm going to talk in particular about the strong law that just recently was passed and went into effect in New York City. The real challenge in passing strong credit check legislation is these guys, remember them, they don't want their ability to sell credit reports to employers to be restricted. And the local Chamber of Commerce usually stands by their side. I think the reason for this is primarily ideological. They don't like the idea that anyone is going to be imposing a new restriction on business or telling companies that they have to do their hiring in a different way than they've been doing it. And so when it becomes clear that a credit reporting bill is moving, the strategy of the credit reporting companies and their industry association is the Consumer Data Industry Association. That's their lobby group. Their strategy is to put in as many exemptions into these bills as possible. And big employers who are used to conducting credit checks also lobby for their own kind of specialized carve-outs from the law. As a result, we end up, in many cases, many of these state laws with weak laws that are so full of exemptions that they don't really end up helping people. And there are some state laws on credit checks that exempt, for example, anyone who handles money. That would be retail workers or restaurant servers. Others exempt anyone in a management position, which really puts a ceiling on how high somebody can rise in their occupation, in their profession. In New York City, where we just passed the strongest bill in the country, the reason it's so strong is because the exemptions are very minimal. And I will say a bit about how we organized and won this legislation in New York City. And I'm really channeling for this section Demos' senior campaign strategist, Emmanuel Caicedo, who was the true organizing genius behind this legislation in terms of Demos' contribution. So our effort in New York City dates back to 2011, 2012. And for the first 2 years, the bill really didn't go anywhere. It hardly got any movement because of opposition from then Mayor Michael Bloomberg. And his opposition, again, was ideological. He just didn't want to see more restrictions on businesses and who they could hire or how they could do their hiring. And the city council speaker at the time, who was taking a lot of cues from the mayor, just didn't allow the legislation to move forward, even though it had a lot of support on the city council and a really strong and vigorous sponsor. In 2014, New York elected a new mayor, Bill de Blasio, and a new city council speaker, Melissa Mark-Viverito. And in many ways, the primary challenge for this phase of the campaign became, how do we pass the best version of a credit check ban that the country has seen without all of these exemptions that lobbyists had succeeded in inserting into other city and state laws? So in New York City, we wanted to really be setting a new standard, and so our expectations and demands were high. The key reason that we were able to get a strong bill was that we were part of a really strong and incredible coalition, the New York City Coalition to Stop Credit Checks in Employment. And I think we have a slide later with their website, but the website is creditcatch22.org. So creditcatch22.org. The coalition included more than 80 organizations, community-based organizations, labor unions, civil rights groups, student groups, immigrant rights groups, political organizations. There were some sympathetic business leaders that were involved, and policy and advocacy organizations. And these groups all really brought their different strengths. Legal services groups were really critical in bringing the on-the-ground perspective of working with their clients. We had the city's largest municipal union, which was really key in getting political leaders' attention. Local groups like the New Economy Project that convened the coalition, and the New York Public Interest Research Group that was able to organize large groups of students who were concerned that their student debt was going to impact their future employability. And there's nothing like having a whole lot of loud students at a rally to get you some attention and some energy. In New York, we had an inside-outside strategic approach. On the outside, we educated and organized the public. Inside, we worked with our allies on the city council to educate other policymakers. And at times, we had to hold them to account about really staying strong on not allowing too many exemptions into this legislation. The real challenge in New York was about keeping the issue visible and pressing for action and making sure that there was a sense of urgency about it. Mayor de Blasio came into office with a mandate to create progressive change, but banning employment credit checks was not at the top of his policy agenda. So we struggled with how to make the legislation a priority for city leaders who were just getting accustomed to governing, and at the same time were more focused on moving along some higher profile, better known agenda items. We needed to create some urgency. We framed the issue in a number of ways as a worker justice and economic justice issue of improving economic opportunity for workers and lifting the floor for everyone, as a debt issue, which is really somewhat taboo in our society because people don't want to talk about their individual debt and how it impacts them. And as a student issue, and students, as I said, really elevated this issue. NYPIRG mobilized students on campuses, hundreds of young people and as a racial equity issue as well, and a structural barrier to employment that disproportionately impacts communities of color. And finally, a moral issue that people of faith could really respond to. It's just the right thing to do, and there's not a reason that this barrier should exist to people who already are facing various types of disadvantage. So one of our biggest challenges was the way in which employment credit checks is a relatively unknown issue, and there's just a big gap in public consciousness. And so we wrote op-eds, blog posts, articles, we published policy briefs, reports. Now that the law has been passed, the Department of the Human Rights Commission, which is responsible for enforcing it, is doing a big public awareness campaign with ads and leafleting at subway stops to let people know that this practice is no longer acceptable. Employment credit checks are no longer allowed in New York City. One additional challenge that I want to highlight is really the importance of finding the right spokespeople, individuals who lived through the experience of being denied a job because of their credit. And it's a challenge because people who have been impacted by employment credit checks are difficult to find, and so many people never know that their credit was the reason they've been denied work. And because people are reluctant to speak out and be the public face of discrimination at a time when many of them may still be on the job market. And we were lucky enough to find some powerful, really brave spokespeople through some of the unions and grassroots organizations who spoke out and really were leaders in our campaign. But it was a real challenge that you should be aware of in your work if you are trying to promote legislation to move this issue forward. So now I'm going to turn it back over to CSAJ to talk about some other systems advocacy strategies.
Yeah, thanks again, Amy. I think that your work here in New York City is just really kind of inspiring in looking at how you approach the issue and thought about it. So all I want to do here, because we do want to try to get some of your voices in the last couple minutes before we log off, is just to kind of lay out a lot of what Amy said, and in terms of thinking about how to approach this in your community, doing your research and understanding how the issue is showing up in your organization, as well as maybe your region or even state, and what role that you have. And then thinking about the different places that you can advocate. There are different avenues that you can really take. And as Amy mentioned, this Credit Catch 22 coalition, they do a really good job. This links to their blog that really demonstrates all the different activities that they did to kind of bring the awareness to this issue, who they were talking to, and how they pushed it. And then in addition to this stuff, Erica mentioned a little earlier, all the opportunities to do some partnership building, whether it's with employers, with other organizations, with employment attorney or other consumer advocate experts, and also engaging with CSAJ or DEMOS and doing some coalition building so that we can support you in what way makes sense to make some change, which is what we want to get to. And so we just wanted to summarize everything that Amy said in terms of some good statements to help you frame the argument as you're talking about it, either within your organization or within your systems advocacy efforts. So take a look at that. And finally, to end, we did want to try to get your insight on how you think you can help move this work forward locally. And by that, we're talking about one thing you can do to learn more about this, or one thing that you'd like to advocate for. Any thoughts on what you feel inspired to do coming away from today? And as Amy mentioned, I think that as you all are thinking, also think about this question: what would be helpful to you to move some work forward? And if CSAJ can help help you take up the torch, so to speak. How can we be helpful? Is it more information? Is it helping build some coalition thinking about some ways together to approach different advocacy approaches in different regions, giving a voice to the issue? Let us know.
And one of the participants, who I assume is from Oregon, has written a little homework assignment for herself to check on the laws in her state and include this information in an advocacy newsletter. And I think we do have some resources, right, that can help folks to identify what the law is in their state.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, and Oregon is one of the states that has restrictions on employment credit checks, and because it's one of the earlier states, it actually has a better law, because I think the credit reporting industry hadn't fully ramped up their advocacy efforts in opposition to these laws. So Oregon has one of the stronger state laws.
Great.
That's good to know.
And so some of these resources are on this slide, I see.
Yeah, we just wanted to highlight all the work that Amy has done at BMOS, from her research to some of the broader advocacy, as well as the New York examples here. So these will all be made available to you. We'll send them out along with the recording and materials, and there'll be kind of live links in the slides that we send out as well. And then there is a host of information on credit as well as employment that we have and that other folks have. So we encourage you to check out part 1 in terms of credit reporting and repair, our fact sheet that we'll be releasing soon, and we'll drop it right into your hot little hands, as well as other information on employment and employment advocacy, looking at some non-discrimination work that's going on. So there's a whole host of resources out there around these issues that can really be, hopefully can be helpful to you as you start to move forward in this work. And then CSAJ also has a really good resource library in thinking about how this issue fits in with other issues facing survivors, and how we can adapt our advocacy approaches as well as our organizations and our whole community and systems approach to this work. So we do encourage you to check out some of these key resources to understand how some of these things might be appearing in your own work, and some ways to start thinking about some ways to address them in really innovative ways. And so finally, I just want to thank Amy so much for all of the expertise that she's brought to us today, as well as Erica, and from myself, we thank you for joining us and participating. And if you need anything or want to follow up and think with us about things, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah,
it was great to join you.
Thanks. Huge thanks, and thanks to everybody for participating. We look forward to hearing about how some of this work translates into your own work on the ground, and please do let us know about ways that we can support your efforts. And
one way you can do that is you're logging off. You will receive a little evaluation about this webinar. In addition to letting us know what you thought, please do write down some ways that you can either use our help or you're thinking about engaging this, because these webinars are really an opportunity for us to gather some good information from you in the field and help drive some national work. So please do complete those evaluations, and thank you again for your time, and we will see you when we see you.